All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Khaldun Swice, Professor, Philosophy and Engaging Culture in a way as productive, persuasive, and finally, redemptive. I have a special guest with me today, a fellow one who's on a journey of faith as much as I am, Dr. Carrie Gress. Is it Grace or Grice?
Gress, actually, Gress, yeah.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Let's see here. If I get your proper introductions, you have a doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America, which is close to my heart. Philosophy, that is, the university. Yeah, she's editor of the online magazine Helena Daily, which is an English or English as a second language website. Is that correct?
Oh, no. Actually, it's called Theology of Home. .com now. So yeah, I don't know. You must have gotten a really old bio, but yeah.
Yeah, that's an older bio there. Interesting. Okay. Well, Theology of Home looks good as well. I saw that. That's very good. I'll probably put that in the show notes. You're also international Marian Association. You're a member of them. Author of 7 books, is it, or is it 8 now?
Oh yeah, you got the very old bio. It's 10 actually.
10? Yeah, I definitely got an old bio. Well, I'm glad we are updating that. That's great. Well, I'm looking at Anti-Mary Exposed, which I love. And I'm also looking at the other one, End of Woman, which is a fascinating book, which I highly recommend. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a question that'll there's this question that's been very difficult for people to answer lately. And let's go ahead and get into that with you. So Judge Jackson Brown was asked a question in the Senate, and it made the rounds as a viral video. What is a woman? And she said, I can't answer that. I'm not a biologist.
Oh, I know.
Let's go ahead and get started with that.
Yeah. So what is a woman? Yeah, no, I think this is a really important question. And one of the things that has obviously motivated my own work, because I think we have some very good answers of what a woman is. And it's obviously become very taboo to not want to answer it because of the trends that have happened in our culture. But the short answer is a woman is an adult female human. But I think we can do much better with a longer answer and a bigger answer. And I actually have a whole chapter that sort of goes into this in my latest book, The End of Woman. Just really looking at what are these commonalities that we see in women, throughout history. And I think that the biggest one and the one that has become so taboo is to talk about women as mothers. And, when I say mothers, I don't just mean as a biological woman who's given birth to a child. I also mean in a psychological sense. I mean, obviously in an adoptive sense, adopting children, but also in a spiritual and psychological sense, in the sense that we have examples of women religious throughout history. We have examples of the aunt who, mentors and loves her nieces and nephews. We have all these just great examples of women who have done that, what we could call mothering or mentoring or sheltering others so that they can become who it is that God created them to be. Kind of creating that space where, a woman is really a guard against the world, just to protect a child in very, specific ways, or to nurture a child or even adults. So, and I think the hard part about this definition is that people have come to think of motherhood in a very narrow sense. And this is what we've really come to reject, is this idea of mothering should sort of become this, it's like getting a driver's license. You're either, it's an option in your life, instead of it being this foundational characteristic that women have the capacity to use and give back to culture in so many different ways, whether it's in the home, in the workplace, all of those different areas in which women are engaged. And, this is one of the beautiful attributes that you can see, across cultures, across millennia. It's just something that has always been there. And obviously there have been many women who have not done a good job of living this out.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's not still an attribute. It's just, can be lived out well or poorly.
Okay. It's fascinating to me, the concept on language and how important linguistic chaos can ensue in culture if we don't know what things are. I'm referring specifically to an essay written by Aldous Huxley in 1940 called Words and Meaning, where he says words and meanings are not matters entirely for academic amusement for linguists and logicians. They are the matters of the profoundest ethical significance for every human being. And he talks about how the words can influence people to either go to war or pull away from war, can either bring peace or destruction. Because if we don't know what things are, we play with the language. And and Oxford University still has the definition of woman as a biological female, but Cambridge University updated it to one who identifies as a woman.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think that this is the real problem, is that because we have made motherhood such a bad thing, we sort of taken women out, and we I don't know how deeply philosophically you want to get into this, but we ontologically in our being, you can see the attributes of womanhood, nourishing, holding our wombs, it's the first home. Every child in the world today was first housed in a woman's body. I mean, these are ontological realities that point to something more significant on a spiritual level, soul level. But when you take that part out and you just say women are that which they do, then you really lend yourself to a kind of relativism, because this is where you now can allow men to become women because they're doing the very same thing that women do. So what's differentiating us? And I think that's the fundamental problem, is we've gotten away from this idea of being and existence and move more towards action and doing. And even you're talking about this kind of warring that's happening. One of the things that we see in the research of a woman, I don't know if you've ever run across the work of Erica Commissar. She's a Jewish woman that is a psychoanalyst in New York, and she's written this book called Being There, and she talks very specifically about how women have lost this capacity to have empathy towards their own children. And you can see just fundamentally how that kind of fracturing, which has happened very explicitly with feminism, is creating so much brokenness and fracturing in our own culture, because people are not getting what they need from the very earliest stages from their mothers, and certainly not from their fathers either, because of this playing with ideas about what it is that women are.
That's fascinating. There's so much we can unpack in what you just said there. In your book on The End of Woman, you talked about the problems of the founders of feminism that had significantly with their fathers, such as Shelley and Walter Stroff and others, and their families, and how those terrible experiences formed who they were and tried to react against the patriarchy, so to speak. Or I want to unpack that with you to see what that means on that level.
Yeah, so this was one of the things I wasn't really expecting to find when I wrote this book. I thought, I just want to go back and look at the first wave of feminism and just sort of do some due diligence and make sure I really understand it well, because, I had been told, like so many people, that the first wave was actually really good. And then there was this break in the second wave. And that's really when feminism kind of went off the rails and became so radical. And so this was the fascinating thing, was to go back and actually look at, if you go back to Mary Wollstonecraft, who's considered really the first feminist, even though that language wasn't used until much later, you can see that there's just this incredible pattern of brokenness that happened. Wollstonecraft in particular had this horrible example of parents, very abusive, drunken father. And her mother just, had a favorite son and kind of treated the rest of the children not well, and was really just beaten down by her husband. And you can see this awful model of a domineering husband and a submissive mother in a very broken iteration of that, and how much that could confuse someone. That's just how relationships are supposed to be like, if that's your only model of it. So yeah, that was the interesting pattern, was to see over and over again, you have these broken women, or in the case of someone like Percy Shelley, who was actually the son-in-law of Mary Wollstonecraft. They never met one another because of course she died in childbirth, giving birth to Mary Godwin, who later became Mary Godwin Shelley, who was Percy's wife. And of course she wrote Frankenstein. So anyway, it's just one of these kind of powerful nuclear families. But again, there's just so much brokenness and strife in the midst of this family. And out of that comes not a response to how do we bring healing to this, but how do we reject this dynamic entirely so that people don't suffer from this. And I think that's, if you apply that pattern, how do we help women become more like men, which is what Mary Wollstonecraft was asking in many respects. You can see that's really the question of feminism for about 200 years now. And this is how we've gotten to the trans movement, is this idea of really making women more like men, so that we are not vulnerable. We don't have the vulnerability that is associated with our fertility and with raising children, and, you know, all of those kinds of dynamics that are obviously part of human nature. So yeah, it's incredible to start seeing very specifically where, you know, the biographies, how they have lent themselves in the lives of feminism really throughout the last 200 years, and how that's really where the breakage is in these broken women.
Let's talk about the I know it's important, and as a philosopher, you know the importance of definitions, and Socrates said the whole foundation of philosophy is understanding definitions. So let's look into that then. What is feminism? Talk to us about that, the positives and how it's necessary, and then of course where the consequences of that have led to our situation today.
Yeah. Well, I use a very specific definition, and it's kind of threaded throughout my book. But yeah, I think this is one of the problems with feminism, is it's used so generally. People just presume that everybody's sort of on the same page with their definition. And of course, that's not always the case. I mean, people mean very, very different things by it. But what I was trying to get to was seeing this foundational philosophical principles that from the very start, and how you can apply them to the current iteration of feminism. So I don't go into civil rights stuff. I don't go into, all these other radical or more nuanced ideas that related to feminism. And I think some people can also use it very generally, like it's just this idea that women have dignity. But I don't think that actually came from feminism. I think that idea came from Christianity more specifically. And, we've seen this development of time over that. So I think it has a very specific meaning in the last 200 years. And that meaning, there's three parts to it. The first one is, again, asking this idea, how do we make women more like men? But it's specifically related to this idea of egalitarianism, which comes from Mary Wollstonecraft, this idea that we need to collapse any kind of hierarchy, whether it's the church, the military, the monarchy. And she, of course, is responding in many respects to the French Revolution and what she saw there, and how she, she's trying to see this egalitarian, kind of perfection. And that's in many ways, she's adopted that. So that's one piece of it, is sort of this collapsing of male and female to just this what people see as very equal, but in fact is really difficult to make things that are different exactly the same, or have an
androgynous type, this esoteric science fiction.
Yeah, I think there's that going on. That obviously became this idea of smashing the patriarchy. I mean, this is what we are seeing very explicitly, as this belief that there's kind of this social structure that's been set up where men are just trying to oppress women. So that's the first leg of it. The second one is this idea of free love, and getting rid of monogamy, and really getting rid of the nuclear family. And that's also there from the early 1820s. And this is all three of these ideas come from Percy Shelley, sort of combining and creating a woman in one of his poems that embodied these things. And we see this idea of free love and trying to get rid of monogamy also in the later suffrage movement in the United States. We see it when feminism actually takes on a lot of communist ideas in the 1900s, and we can talk about that shortly. But we can see this pattern, even if you look around today, this is very much alive, that, the destruction of the family. And then the third one is the occult. And, I think this was the most shocking piece for me. There's a great book I used a lot of research from, called Satanic Feminism. And this was written by a man who was, I think, his either dissertation or habilitation in Sweden, and it's published through Oxford University Press. So this is not some like creepy esoteric book that is just out there. This is it's not something I downloaded from the internet, but it has real credentials and a lot of very thorough research on this topic. And the author really goes into certainly with Percy Shelley, the role of the occult. You can see this certainly in the threads of Frankenstein, and this, idea of creation and creating life. And, electricity is just something that's just kind of coming up, and people are fascinated by all these concepts. And Shelley in particular was very, he got sent out of Oxford, I think, because he wrote some piece about atheism. He spent the night in a coffin one night trying to connect with the devil. I mean, he had this very wild sense of his own freedom, very much actually along the lines of the Marquis de Sade, that we see this idea of like pressing against any kind of taboos or any kinds of limitations on humanity. And of course, Shelley dies in a boating accident when he's 29. It's just, he's again sort of trying to push these limits, and finally the limits push back on him, and he didn't survive that. But that's really another concept that's just thread throughout the whole thing. Shelley wrote about using the ideas of Milton, actually, in Paradise Lost. He wrote about how in Genesis 3, rather than your typical reading of the temptation and fall of Adam and Eve, he actually says, the temptation by the serpent is actually an opportunity for Eve, and she gets this very special knowledge and wisdom from that encounter. And that's what women have now, is this kind of, or have the capacity for, is this kind of wisdom from the serpent. So these are all seeded very, very early into feminism, and you can see them again. I did a lot of work on Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and there's large connections with the occult there because of what's happening in the United States at that point. And then, of course, moving into the 1900s, it's just rife with the occult. And you can see that now today with a lot of celebrities being very involved in witchcraft and, psychics and tarot cards and, all of those kinds of things. It's just been this sort of wave that just has continued in the movement for all those years.
I see that in Grammy Awards and satanic dances and costumes.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I'm curious, on a spiritual level, you said earlier in the conversation that you think there's a satanic roots to feminism, and you also said that Christianity is the one that brought dignity of woman. I remember, Carrie, I was in a feminist bookstore here in Chicago, and I looked in the religion section, and I noticed they had no Bible.
Oh, so interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, come on, the most popular book in the world is selling a lot, at least make money on it. But so
Yeah.
I walked in and I asked them, why don't you have one? Well, that's the most oppressive book there is. And they went on and on. And we had this fiery conversation about this. Talk to us about why you think Christianity is the one that brings dignity to women, when a lot of feminists are saying, no, the Bible is the one that's used patriarchy to shove women quiet, and St. Paul telling them to be quiet and put on their aprons and go in the kitchen or wear a head covering.
Right. All of that. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the places where you do see this Bible, a commentary on it, is in Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She actually wrote a book called The Women's Bible that she wrote with other feminists and theosophists. Theosophy is, I think, what we would sort of think of now as kind of a new age, cobbling together of many different religions. But anyway, it also embodied this idea of, sort of Eve was this heroine of Genesis instead of being, falling from it. So that's one of the interesting things, is just to see how that scripture was Cady Stanton herself was very anti-Christian, and they were trying to really go back to the very beginning. Of course, I mean, this is the roots of all Christian Western civilization, really, and rewrite it in such a way so that they knew that's where they had to go, was the foundations. And this is why it was such an important piece for them to do even in the 1800s. So that's an interesting piece that you can still buy it online, and it sort of reads like a bitter teenager, kind of just angry about all kinds of things. But I think that the fascinating thing is just the fundamental misunderstanding of, and the really reorganizing. I mean, Christianity obviously has this very kind of structured understanding of the way in which God created the world. You've got God, you have Adam, we have this in the creation stories, and then there's Eve, who's the helpmate, and then together they have dominion over the earth and whatnot. And feminism really turns that on its head with this new Genesis reading, because then you have the serpent imparting wisdom to Eve. She's then sort of lord over her husband, and God's really nowhere in the picture. So you can see how that mechanism actually works to really undermine Christianity. It also undermines the authority of men and the gifts that men have and bring to the table to women and to civilization. And it's also interesting to just even look at the way in which I've called feminism really kryptonite for men, because nobody wants to touch it. Men don't want to, get into an argument about it. Nobody wants to talk about it really with women who are really energized and angry and anxious and have on this just rage about it. So it's interesting to see how that has played out. But in any event, no, I think, we obviously know in Christianity, Christ, the way, the way Jesus on earth treated women these were not the socially acceptable ways in which he treated someone like Mary Magdalene or the mother, his own mother. And these are very important clues and cues that I think just change the way in which women are understood and their equal dignity. I think there's also a lot of work that has been done about that beautiful relationship between man and woman, that complementarity that I think is so vital and important. I just read there's a German scholar that is here in the United States that she's just published a book and talks about that language of helpmate. And one of the translations is actually help that only God can give, which I'd never read before, but it makes a lot of sense that there's something, women have the capacity to reflect others. They're like a mirror. They sort of reflect off of others. And this is how Adam finally understands himself in context of his wife. You see this in the context of children as well, that especially young children, they're always sort of checking back in with mom. There's sort of this home base that happens where they come to understand themselves and then from there have this freedom. So all of these things I think have really been swept under the carpet because, again, we're trying to make women like men and have them sort of be this domineering control and power over the whole culture instead of otherwise. And so I think it's one of the very challenging pieces is just the deep misunderstanding that there is about Christianity and this desire to really crush it and replace it with something that they think is more compelling, but in fact is actually much more devastating and denigrating to women as we're seeing the culture today.
Yeah, I see. I remember, and this has really stuck out to me, Carrie, is the distinction in Genesis chapter 1. So you have on the first page of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, you have God saying that man is made in the image of God. He created them, male and female. Women are given that same dignity as man does on the very first page of the scriptures.
Yeah.
It's a foundational thing for building the dignity and the honor of them. But do you see a pushback saying, well, if that's the case, then why are women not given all the hierarchical positions and leadership positions in culture that many feminists say is a glass ceiling?
Yeah.
Have to break through to get through.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this again is sort of that idea of just that we have had this belief that women are only successful if they are doing exactly what men do. And it goes back to this idea of the denigration of women, and motherhood. We haven't said a good thing about being a mother in 50 years. So this is what we've pushed on the culture. I grew up in this. I think so many, we've been so deeply sort of marinated in these ideas that it's hard for us to start thinking outside of them. And I think this is one of the things that my book tries to do, is just to encourage women to start thinking like, maybe some of the things that I've been told are actually not right. Maybe these are not actually benefiting me. And, it's interesting to look at some place like China, in the 1900s, you have communism really sweeping through the whole world. Really they're trying different ways to sort of implement Marxism throughout the world. And at one point, before the revolution in China, women were asked, do you want to go to work and then also still be a mother? And the Chinese women were like, are you crazy? Like, no, I'm not going to go work in the field all day and then do everything I do at home all day at night. And, it's really interesting to see that pushback, because the fact that these are women that were being sent into the field versus, in our own culture, we've really glamorized, I think, the work in the United States. Right. And made women really believe that this is where their greatest happiness is going to be. But this is sad. The sad reality is, and we see this with feminism, women are not happier today than they were before feminism, which doesn't mean that all women were happy. We know that there was tragedy and loss and suffering. But what has happened is we've tried to tell women, you are going to fulfill yourself in your work, which is, of course, a very Marxist idea. Arbeitsmachtfrei. This is in Hitler's Nazism. This is in Stalin in the early Bolshevik Revolution and thereafter. This idea that work is really going to free us. But fundamentally, women cannot be fulfilled by their work. Women are made to be in very rich and deep relationships. And this is the hard thing, is we're making these decisions when we're least vulnerable in our lives. And they are going to affect us when we're most vulnerable in our lives, because so many women forego having children, they forego husbands, they're so focused on their career. And then, of course, something happens in their career and they realize how dispensable they are, how, all this work that they've put into this career isn't loving them back. There's no staying power. I talked to one woman who was saying, I had worked at this company for 20 years, and literally by like the next week, she said she got sick and she had to quit her job. She was just sort of a forgotten person. And she was by herself, and she just realized, why I put all my energies into this instead of that which would really enrich my life at this point as an older woman. So anyway, I think there's all kinds of ways in which we need to really look at this and question this idea of, is this glass ceiling and that all that we're striving for really part of our nature and part of who it is that we're meant to be, or is there something much deeper and more beautiful and compelling that I think women are called to?
That's beautiful. I would like to unpack that with you to see how this would return to femininity, so to speak. A lot of the themes of your books and the danger of taking down the patriarchy and how that is actually working against that and dealing with the zeitgeist of culture. I'm curious. There's work in the New York Times, for example. Maureen Dowd wrote a piece where she argued that the most miserable demographic of people in the world are sometimes the most successful. The people who have a woman she's talking about. And she says that women make up now about 60 to 80% of students in college, which is the case in my own classes as well. They're surpassing men in areas like medicine and technology, and in areas of the humanities. I have more professors in my college that are women than others, but they argue that they're the most miserable group of people. When you ask them on a deep level, are they happy? Especially the single ones. I think they're focusing specifically on women in their 40s who have taken on the new position of the cat mom now. But and not to say anything about owning cats is bad, but cats I think are somewhat evil anyway. You have this idea that being a mother and pouring yourself into a new generation is outdated. Speak to the young women who are actually listening to this right now. Talk to them and see how maybe you can provide some kind of inspiration to them in that regard. And before you do that, let me just say this to my listeners. If you're following me, I appreciate you giving me a like and a follow. That would help me to continue doing what I'm doing and to inspire and to equip you to continue doing what you're doing in a way that honors God. Please.
So I mean, the first thing I would comment about your your cat mom situation. We've gotten to this place in the United States where there are actually more pets in people's homes than there are children, and that's an amazing testimony, because I think what it tells us is that women still need to mother something. They still have this innate desire to love and be loved. And obviously there's only, it's much more limited experience, but even the language of it, it used to be pet ownership. I know when I was growing up, like we own a pet, and now we're pet moms and pet parents, and even plant parents is the new one that's coming up right now. Plant parents. So I think that it's encouraging though to see that and say that desire hasn't been snuffed out of us. It's still there. We just have what happens when you take children out of the picture. And women are going to try and find other ways to fill that gap. And the great thing though is that there's so many people that are in need. There are women out there who've gotten past that point where they're not going to be able to have biological children. That doesn't mean that they don't have purpose and meaning in their life. And I think that's the exciting thing about when you really realize that you're meant to mother others, not in a smothering, codependency, weird, creepy kind of controlling way. And we all know those people, but in a way that's really like dialed in and focused on the needs of others, and trying to, this is what I do all the time with my own children, try to anticipate their needs before they even know what they are. And obviously I do it imperfectly a lot of times, but that doesn't mean that I'm not trying and that they're not aware of that. And sometimes I do get it right. But I think that the beautiful thing though too is that when you are doing that, that's where the rich relationships come from. That's where the real meaning and purpose in your life come from, that kind of mentoring or gifting of self, that outpouring of yourself. And this is what all Christians are called to. And that's really where joy comes from. And, I think that we have missed this idea of kenosis, this outpouring. and miss that there's actually incredible joy in it. And, when I was a young mother, I think I spent week after week thinking, okay, next week it's going to be easier. It's going to be easier. It's going to be easier. And I finally realized, like, no, it's actually not going to get easier. But what's happening is I'm changing. I'm being really formed by this. I'm losing a lot of my narcissism, a lot of my self-centeredness. I'm becoming much more focused on someone else. And when you do that, that's really where joy and happiness can stem from and can come from. So it's, to young women, I would say in particular, like, pay attention. It's really interesting to see what's happening in the culture. All these things that we've been told are taboo about homemaking, they're all now back in style, from sourdough bread to people who can homestead to knitting, sewing, gardening. All of these things are really have taken off again in really beautiful and compelling ways. But of course, the word homemaker still hasn't taken off yet. And this is one of the things I do at Theology of Home, is just, we've been so indoctrinated to believe that the savvy, healthy woman is the one who's out working and she's independent. That's the model we've been given. And then the flip side of that is really this doormat of a woman who has no will and no, intelligence and whatnot. And I think this is what we have to understand, is that the truth is in the middle, where you have this woman who is healthy and ordered, and she knows what her gifts are, and she knows that she's meant to love other people. And it doesn't have to be done in a frumpy, awkward, miserable way. So I think that that's what we have to really start doing, just even as Christians, and even speaking to that question of culture. Is how do we start putting flesh on these ideas and making women realize that there's, these two binaries that we've been given are actually not real or healthy, but there's something that is really beautiful and compelling and healthy that's, is a kind of in the middle of those two things, which, of course, we know Aristotle's been saying this for years. Our minds, like, since, millennia, really, the mind likes a binary. And this is what the left has locked into, and why it's so confusing for Christians, because we're having a hard time not only identifying that there's something, a third piece, but the culture isn't demonstrating it to us in any way. We're getting their messages over and over and over again in magazines, Hollywood, politics, book publishing, fashion industry. All of this is loaded with leftist ideology, and Christianity hasn't stepped in to that vacuum yet and offered something more compelling and beautiful, which we have. It's just a matter of realizing that we have to start doing this, I think.
Right. Unfolding it and letting it blossom in ways that have been stifled for so long. That distinction and difference. What do you do then with the vast majority of the generation of women who have grown up in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, even now, even the newer generations are coming up? They're told that you have to be assertive, you have to be strong, you have to be successful. You have to wait till later to have children. By that time, what, 30s or 40s, the late eggs are almost all gone, right? From a woman's in a biological sense. So what do you do with a woman who wants to be feminine, wants to have a relationship, wants to grow in as a wife or something, but she's single? And the culture is telling her you have to do this. And so as a result, by default, she's developing these masculine traits in order to survive in a cutthroat environment in the business world, whether she's a lawyer or an attorney or even in professorship.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question. And it's a hard one to answer, again, because we don't have good models of it, because we've been so encouraged and pushed in this one direction. And this is something I had to deal with in my own life. I was a doctoral student in Washington, D.C. I was working in a think tank, and I had this series of boyfriends that broke up with me, and then they married a kindergarten teacher. And I finally, this pattern repeated enough that I was like, okay, what do the kindergarten teachers have? What's going on here?
Yeah.
And I was in my 30s at this point. And I finally just started listening, paying attention to how men speak about women when they don't think they're being listened to. I mean, one great place for that is music and poetry. Go back and hear what the things are that men admire in women. And, it was a real light bulb moment for me. I realized, all this assertiveness and aggressiveness that actually I didn't really like. I wasn't that comfortable, and I wasn't very good at it. I didn't need to do that. And that there was something really important about, again, being in a relationship with people where they felt loved, and they felt, heard, and they felt cared for. And again, not in weird or creepy ways, but just, in a healthy way to be in relationship with people. And so I spent like a year just sort of trying to figure out what this was. I changed a little bit the way I dressed. I got rid of sort of the power suit look. I started wearing more cardigans, and just it was a funny thing because about a year later, I was in the metro in DC, and this really handsome young man walked up to me and said, "Are you a kindergarten teacher?" And it was great. It was sort of like I've arrived, and some of that is just little things like smiling more and not feeling like you're always in this angry relationship with people, just feeling like you just need to love people where they're at kind of thing. So anyway, that was my own experience. And I think that there's a lot that can happen that you really unfurl your own personality when you feel like you don't have to sort of fit into this model of what the culture says. And, it was years later, I didn't get married until maybe 4 or 5 years after that, but it was these kinds of things that I know have really formed me, especially to be a mother. Because, and as one of my bosses used to say, honey attracts. It's much easier to get a child to do what you want when you're smiling at them and they feel loved than it is, to beg them or nag them, like with a husband. No one wants to be a naggy wife.
Yeah.
So I think that these are just really important skills that the women just haven't even been taught or even thought that they should think about, because they sort of have this sense that these are not important things. And then when you get into them, you realize like, this was my situation. Like I didn't even know how to cook really. I ate out all the time. So it was actually my husband who taught me to cook because he loved cooking. So it's all of this skill set that we say, don't develop this skill set, but then when you do get married and have children, you're really bad at it. So you think I'm not a good mother, I'm not a good wife. And then you think I'm going to go back to what I'm familiar with instead of saying, maybe these are things I could actually learn, or maybe these things aren't nearly as important as I think, and I can find workarounds or whatever. But when we don't actually train women. And the other thing that's interesting too is just to even think about how much easier it is to control your career than it is to control relationships with people.
Right.
So we can't make the man that we're going to marry show up like that. We can't just pick one and say, this is the one that's going to ask me to marry him. There's a certain amount of receptivity and relationship and getting to know each other and discerning and, seeing what God wills, really. And I think that that's one of the reasons why feminism has so much appeal, because it allows a woman to sort of feel like she's in control of her life in the way that all of these other elements of family don't allow you, which of course then begs the question, like maybe there's some kind of perfection and virtue in learning to trust God in these things instead of always trying to be in control of our situation.
That's powerful. I know one of my favorite passages in the scriptures is Proverbs 31, where it talks about the virtuous woman.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that in the middle of the night last night. Yeah.
Were you? Can you talk to us about that and how that would be encouraging to?
It's actually really interesting. When I was doing marriage prep with my husband is American, but we met when we were living in Italy. And I had this very holy priest who was helping to prepare us for marriage. And he had written up, he wrote something up for us that I've hung on to. And so one of the things was this commentary on Proverbs 31 and the idea of the virtuous woman. And, this is something that I think Christians don't really understand the idea of virtue very well, that there's these ways in which we become more perfect. Virtues and vices sort of live together in tandem. Sometimes our greatest virtue is also our greatest vice. And it's a matter of sort of honing that. But you can't hone a virtue without it actually being pushed against. Or you can't become, there's no way to become patient if you've never had to be patient with something, unless you have sort of a naturally infused grace from God or a specific kind of gift. But we can look at our specific kinds of vices that we have and see that these are actually the virtues that we can develop. So if I'm really angry, that personality, that means I probably have a deep capacity for patience or, steadiness. If I'm really anxious, that means I probably have a capacity for courage, that these things are being allowed to happen in our lives so that we can develop the virtues. And anyway, I think that's, I marveled a lot because when I was getting married, when we were doing this preparation for marriage, I wasn't thinking at all about writing about women.
Right.
I didn't even write about women. I thought it was just too academic. I didn't feel that there was a way in which you could talk about it that women would really be interested in. But at the same time, I had this deep desire to reach women that were, like my mom and my sisters and my friends. I wanted them all to really have a deep faith. And so anyway, it was just the middle of the night, I was just reminded of this idea of the virtuous woman, and how this is the real goal, is to develop these virtues. And when we develop them, it doesn't mean we become cookie cutters of each other. In fact, that's the more beautiful piece, is that you then see the more people grow in virtue, the more unique they become, and the more you can see sort of that spark of God and a uniqueness in them in different ways. But yeah, so I was just kind of marveling that all those years ago, this priest who knew I was a journalist, but I wasn't writing, like I said, wasn't writing books at that point, had written very specifically on this Proverbs woman, and now how much that really animates my work and focus in my life at this point.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I'm writing a current essay right now, which may actually become a book later, on 5 contradictions or what feminists don't want you to know. And one of them is about the ever longing for Romeo for Juliet and Juliet for Romeo. That all the billers and the songs and the music and the poetry and history, the most famous ones are for the feminine, the beauty, the angel, who's quietly shining in the darkness, not the strong, assertive, powerful woman that feminism seems to put forward. It seems to fly against that, and the concept of hypergamy. Are you familiar with that?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Okay, hypergamy is a psychological term. It's very popular among the some of the writings on feminism now. Is that women in general tend to choose men who are equal or higher on the socioeconomic scale. This is across demographics all over the world.
Yeah.
Men
right. Another term for
it. Or lower. And that has something to do with, of course, the God-given desire for men to be the provider protector. And men feel more alive when they're able to do that. But it's harder for them to do that who's a woman who's more powerful, making more than them.
Yep. No, I think that, and the only way I've actually really seen that work well is if a younger man marries an older woman, where he doesn't feel the competition because he knows that she's older. I've seen it work very effectively in relationships with that. But yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting theme, and I would love to see you develop it more, that idea, because there's something really important that I think women don't understand about sort of this idea of gathering people in, of helping them restore themselves and heal themselves. And, one of the hardest lessons I had to learn as a mother was just sometimes the children just need to be held. Like, you don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything. They just want to be with you. They just want that, the comfort. There's obviously, we know there's biological, oxytocin is released and all of those kinds of things, but just the importance of being present to someone, I think, goes so far. And it felt very counterintuitive to me, because I'm very, very good at multitasking, and I'm very focused. I like to get things done. So it was an interesting thing for me to finally realize this and sort of give up my efforts to try and do something for them, but instead just be present to them. And I think that obviously plays itself out in terms of the relationship with men, and that sort of coming back into the world, into this place that feels safe, it feels nurturing, it feels healing and restorative. All of those kinds of things are what we long for in our homes. And I think that these are unique gifts that women have the capacity to give others, and we've sort of complicated it or made it a negative thing, when in fact it's this is where the empathy and that the capacity to heal others is just so beautiful, and where they're really met. And it's it's done so much damage because we've decided that those aren't important aspects of life anymore, that it's much more important for us to sort of be doing instead of being.
Okay, well, interesting. This issue of being rather than doing is so critical in understanding our psychology and who we are before God. I'm curious how you would look at something like the concept of equality in culture and equality between men and women. Do you see that as a hierarchical thing? How do you reconcile that with your faith, when the standard model is it's God, man, woman, children, animals, rocks, etc.? It's this hierarchy that seems to come down from from the ancient theologies, where modern egalitarianism says, no, men and women are equal. They should be treated equal. They can do anything each other could do.
Yeah.
Talk about that equality issue and how we could parse that out and still maintain our beautiful differences.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of it touches on the themes that we've already talked about. Like women are doing things that they don't really even want to be doing because they've been told that they should do them, and they need to be independent, and they need to be successful. And, all of these kinds of pressures are put on us. But if you look at, and I think the male-female relationship is really special and different in that hierarchy. It's not just we're being overlorded. I think it comes back to that sort of idea of mutual self-sacrifice and self-gift. That idea of Christ, in St. Paul, Ephesians, love your wives like Christ loves the church. Well, what is that? That's a complete outpouring of oneself. And it happens in a very unique way, like you already mentioned, providing, protecting, and propagating. Those things are obviously unique skills that men have. And I've been spending a lot of time. I actually just finished up a book chapter for someone else on this topic, but we have really lost this sense that of our vulnerability and the power that comes with our vulnerability. There's no one more vulnerable than either a woman who's about ready to or has just given birth to a child, and that child is very vulnerable. As a combination, the two of them are incredibly vulnerable, and this is why single motherhood is so arduous, because you need that complementarity, because the child is so tiny and the woman is so vulnerable, and she, through her love, through the love that husband and wife have together, they bring about this great vulnerability that she opens herself up to, and that life comes in that vulnerability. So I think we think of vulnerability as a very, very bad thing, when in fact, when we make the decision to allow ourselves to be vulnerable in pregnancy, that's really where life comes from and is perpetuated. And then you can see that, the dynamic of generations and families and, grandmothers and children and great grandchildren, and, all of that. So I think we need to just start looking at it very differently and start seeing the unique gifts that we both have that complement one another, rather than it just constantly being this like elbowing of each other, like trying to edge out. And this is, again, something I grew up with. I remember being in the first grade, and my father's, encouraging me, saying, "Oh, you can beat out those boys in your classroom." And, it's just silly. When you seeing how deeply it permeates the culture, this desire to sort of one up the men. But when you start, you step out of that and start seeing where really my gifts and where are men's gifts. And again, people are going to be temperamentally different. Sometimes, different people are going to have different strengths. But when that basic foundation is there of the nuclear family, you can see that's really where the society gets its strength.
Right.
But this is exactly why the family has been so targeted by feminism as an ideology, is because this is where they believe their power and strength comes from.
This is interesting. I want to touch on two things. One, that you just discussed, and unpack that with you. And I love that you have a background in philosophy. It just really is amazing. Because most people I talk to who study these kinds of things don't, and they don't go deeper into it. And that's why I really appreciate your work, and highly recommend it to anyone. The concept of woman being not valued in culture is one of the things I'm writing about, and I'm saying, no, that's actually, it's opposite. Women are actually more valued than men. And one of the principles behind that is the concept of going to war. Like, for example, what happened recently in Ukraine, where all the women and children were asked to leave, and the men stayed, who were 60 and under. And even in the US, all men are required to register for the draft at 18. Women are not, although both have the right to vote. Which is ironic, because one is sending the other to die for them, but they're not moving into it themselves. Although about 70% of the U.S. armed forces are women who are very brave, who are moving into that. Talk to us about that concept of women being not valued as men, with this particular caveat. I was looking in 2014, and it made the international airways when Boko Haram, I think, it kidnapped 276 girls. And Sudan and other parts, and the entire world came rallying around it. Even Michelle Obama tweeted, bring back our girls, and others. But I looked into that. I found something interesting, and that's sad that happened. It's terrible. There are Christian girls that were kidnapped, raped, and forced into marriages. They kidnapped and tortured over 10,000 boys before that.
Wow.
But the world was silent when boys are captured, but when women are, the world is rallying behind that. Doesn't that tell us about the value of men and women in culture and the war issue?
Well, I think the bigger issue is that women have a victim status, a victimhood status. And this is really what has been cultivated by Marxism. This is why, it started very early. I've dated back the earliest socialists are trying to rile up women to see themselves as victims in as early as like 1897. These are the socialists that are doing this. And then, early on in the communists period in the 1920s, that there's a woman who actually founded the International Day of Women. She realized how angry a lot of the academic women were, women that were involved in feminism. And, rather than rejecting feminism, they were like, no, we need these women who are all angry to be a part of communism because they're going to agitate for this revolution that we want. They're going to be great foot soldiers. But part of what has happened is that rather than it being a class warfare, and we see this in the New Left, this is exactly what happened in the 1960s and 70s. And that's a whole other podcast. I go into it in the book, but is this idea of instead of it being class warfare, it's suddenly male-female warfare, where the woman is by default a victim and the man by default is the oppressor. No matter what, if anybody had ever been oppressed or oppressing, it was just built into sort of the categories of male and female. And we can see that in intersectionality. There's some great status in being a victim because then you can create all kinds of problems in the culture that then you get government money for. I mean, it's just amazing how much it creates a lever there. And I think this is really what the culture has done by highlighting and focusing and just laser focusing on this idea of women being victims and allowing that status to just remain there. And men, even though, like you mentioned, and I think there's so much research on this in terms of men suffer much more than women do because of wars and because of the kind of work that they do, in effort to provide, that's obviously completely overlooked. And the women are really focused on because it's a hot button minority issue. Journalists love to write about it. And you get money from it through government too. So, and control and power. So those are really what come from it. So this idea that they're going to give up this victimhood status and start saying, oh no, things are looking pretty equal now. It's never going to happen because then they lose their whole platform.
Right, that's a contradiction there, isn't it? You want to say you're equal, but at the same time, you're saying you're more vulnerable and you need good men to stop you from bad men. But
yeah,
that's assumption that men are stronger, more powerful. They have to step up and use that for good, not bad. But that's assuming that you're not, at least on a biological level.
Yeah. No, and it's also one of those things too, where because of bad women, you're also, who are not good mothers, you're also, and because you get rid of monogamy, you're also creating more bad men who are behaving badly. And then you're calling it toxic masculinity. And instead of actually articulating that there really is a good kind of masculinity. So there really is this political and PR kind of effort. There was actually another study that was done recently too about narcissistic characters involved in, I think it was done in Germany, the kind of women that are narcissistic, and they really are energized by the kind of attention that they get from feminism. And so this is not going to be something that they're going to let go of easily, even despite whatever the data says, because this is how they can influence and control others. So I think the key issue is really looking at the influence and the control and the power that is wielded by this victim idea that Marxism has continually, promoting.
That's interesting. You bring that Marxism thing up. I've seen it happen with Black Lives Matter and with critical race theory, and there's a similarity there of the oppressed.
Well, it started with feminism. We would not have had those organizations. In fact, I've had this idea of writing this article in my head for months, and I just haven't gotten to it. But if feminism hadn't been effective in this transitioning of, and instead of it being the classes, making it about male and female, those things could never have flourished. The intersectionality and Black Lives Matter, because that was a linchpin of changing Marx into something that was about race, sex, all of these other pieces. So,
and I understand on a political level why you need to address certain infrastructures of society, such as education and medical parts, where for certain groups are demoralized or not given enough resources. But it's very interesting to me that when you have this kind of mentality, the oppressed and oppressor, you are putting people who have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Like, you see a man, you automatically think potential rapist. Well, he could be
Right.
this, but not necessarily a potential white man or potential, white privilege or something like that. Or a black
Yep.
man, and say, oh, he's potentially going to rob me. That's not fair to the individual when you have this class distinctions put on individuals who have nothing to do with these situations, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sad. I know we want to wrap this interview up, and I really do appreciate your time. There's something that you mentioned in a couple of your books and some of your articles where you have this litany chronicled by in the Greek, is it a Greenwich Village, Lila Karp. Yeah,
Lila Karp.
yeah. In 1969, there's this type of almost ritual where they ask people these questions, these group of women together. And I was actually looking for the source of that, the actual source. I couldn't find it. Maybe I can ask you for that later. But just
from Mallory Millett, Kate Millett's sister is, I think, the one that first wrote it down.
She's the one who got it. That's why, because we couldn't find it anywhere in the literature. But let me read some of that and let me comment on it, because I think it's important. Really, the issue of patriarchy. We'll land the plane with that, if that's okay.
Sure. Right.
It said, why are we here today? And this is Kate Millett listening to these women chanting together. And the question is, why are we here today? The chairwoman asked. To make a revolution, they answered. What kind of revolution? The cultural revolution. And how do we make a cultural revolution? By destroying the American family. How do we destroy the American family? By destroying the American patriarch. How do we destroy the American patriarch? By taking away his power. And how do we do that? By destroying monogamy. And how do we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality. This sounds right out of the pit of hell. But I'm just listening to this. But at the same time, this is what I'm seeing in the sexual revolution. Please comment on this.
Yeah, no, I mean, what Kate Millett was the chairwoman, and it was her sister Mallory who has spoken about this. And Mallory was very engaged with Kate and all that Kate was doing in the early years. But yeah, Kate was a protege of Marcuse and Wilhelm Reich, and Wilhelm Reich was what part of the New Left. He actually wrote a book published in 1936 called The Sexual Revolution. So the sexual revolution was actually sort of intellectually planned. It was a way to start destroying culture and creating room for this cultural revolution that the Marxists wanted, because they knew they couldn't use the model from the old Soviet Bolshevik revolution where they just came in and crushed everyone. They knew they'd be a lot more successful if they could actually integrate it into the culture in a way that felt sophisticated and savvy and compelling. And this is, enter the 1960s. And this is what Kate Millett did with her book, Sexual Revolution. She was on the front cover of Time magazine because of it. Angela Davis is another one who's obviously been very involved in the Black Panthers as well as feminism. Both of them are students of these radical thinkers that are the New Left, from the New Left. So this was the major thing that they did, was how do they infect the whole culture with these ideas? And this is straight from, their work is promoting all of these things. It's really amazing when you look back to the 1960s and 70s when they're chanting this, because none of those things are popularized. Abortion hadn't been legalized yet. Homosexuality was not at all what it looks like today. Promiscuity and prostitution, none of that is really on people's radar in the way that it is today. So it's this, this is one of my arguments. It's one of the most successful ideologies in all of human history.
I think it is the most. Yeah.
How deep its reach has gone, and yet it's still seen as a benefactress to women. Women still view it as something that has helped us, rather than really seeing the rot that.
Peter Kreeft, one of my favorite philosophers, in his book, How to Destroy Western Civilization, the very first page, he says, here's how to do it. Stop having children.
Yeah.
Which is focusing on growing the next generation. How do you take that part? You attack women and tell them, this is not where you grow another way.
Yep. No, it's just that simple. Yeah. And that's what's happened. So we have our work cut out for us, I think.
Yeah, we do. Let's close with a final question. The Barbie movie. You have the floor for that, because that's made a huge, it's got more money than, most of films in the last decade. But it's made a huge impact. Go ahead and comment about that and how it influences the culture.
So the Barbie movie, one of the things I argue in my book is that feminism is a brand, and it's been so successful because it has had the capacity to morph itself throughout the ages and look different to and appeal to women in different ways. And I think that the Barbie movie is just the new iteration of feminism, which is fascinating because feminists hated Barbie, this model of this curvy woman, that perky blonde, feminists
Exactly.
hated Barbie. And
Possible
now,
body dynamics, yeah.
so now somewhere out of the blue, Barbie has sort of become this feminist icon. And, I wrote a review for it actually for the Daily Wire. It was really disturbing to watch it. It's one of those things that I didn't want to go see. I was like, I'm never going to get this hours back. I did go see it.
Me too.
And it's just misery because it's not funny. But there's not a single man in it who's necessary or articulate, or they're all a bunch of buffoons. And the whole message, and people have said, oh, you're reading this too blunt of a way. But I don't think for a movie that's this broadly scaled, I don't think there's trying to work a lot of nuance into it. I think that the fundamental message is men are stupid, and culture and society cannot flourish if we allow men to be in control. Things go much better when women are in control. And we see that even with the very opening scene where you've got these little girls, smashing their doll heads. I mean, it's really disturbing, like
Really
to put that in context.
Abortion, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And that denigration of motherhood and what that means. It's scary when you think about how radically we have warped that relationship between mother and child. I mean, there's nothing more tender. I've had 5 children. I've had several miscarriages. There's something there's nothing deeper really that happens than that mother and child relationship. And this has been the continual warping of it. And again, what are they doing? They're all these career women that don't have children, and it's just very disturbing. So I think this is really what elite women are seeing, is that there's a softening going on in the culture. They've got kind of this rising trend of the soft girl or the trad wives, and they're trying to get out in front of it and say, oh, well, no, we still need feminism because this is how society has to be ordered. And that's what I think that is going on with it. So yeah, it would be great if we could just have movies that were fun about women and men again, instead of constantly like saturated with all of this ideology.
It would definitely. Well, God bless you.
Well, thank you. Likewise.
Thanks for your time and your work, and may God continue to magnify the work of your hands.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it, and likewise.
Thank you. So I appreciate you. All right, let me wrap this up here. And stop.